Faith Science Podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the 11th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of August 4th, 2024, and I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I'm excited about when we are digging into some of these different topics. There's times where we have questions and things that we had like last week, and it leads into the next week so well, unintentionally. And this week, I feel it does it in an amazing way, and you'll find out in a lot of ways here as we go through this podcast. So let's look back at last week's question, which was, where are you acknowledging the impact around you, human or non-human? And some of the responses we got back this week that I thought were important to be thinking about is the impact as us as humans have on the environment all around us, and how we often take it for granted. We see the earth as something that we control. And I think within our faith life, this is something that is true and not true at the same time. Yes, we have dominion. Yes, we are having some authority over it as a gardener, as we have talked about multiple times before. But again, it's also that idea that we are not the landowner. So it's also the idea, this contrast of we are doing this for someone else and taking care of this. So I think it's one of these things that we have to really be thinking about and considering and thinking about. And so I think as we are thinking about the impacts that we as humans have on things around us, as we think about the impacts that we have as humans around us and how we think about things, I think these are all important things for us to be thinking about and contemplating and going through in order for us to really be able to grasp the depth and variety of what God has designed around us and what does that all mean for us in our faith life. But let's just jump into the text this week, because I think we have a good subject this week that we'll be getting into in the science tie-in section. So let's just jump into it. This semi-continuous Old Testament text this week brings us to 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 26 to chapter 12, verse 13a. So this is then continuing the story like we had last week with David and Bathsheba, and it's kind of continuing that story that Uriah is dead, so David then in his mourning takes Bathsheba as his wife. God comes to Nathan then to tell David this story, and he brings up this story of a ewe lamb and how there's a man with a lot of money and there's one that's very poor, and they only had one. The rich man has a traveler come in, and what does he do? He takes the poor man's sheep and offers that for his guests. This enrages David and just is like, this person deserves to die and should restore the lamb fourfold back with no pity. Nathan responds with, "You are that man, and that this is what you have been appointed over this land, and you have all these other wives, and yet then you still killed Uriah the Hittite in order that you might have his wife." And David immediately recognizes what David has done. And this is then leads us into the psalm that goes with that, is Psalm 51, the first 12 verses of it. This is the create in me a clean heart, this idea of how the steadfast love and mercy of God washes us clean, but it's also this recognition on how we fall so short of that we are sinners to our core, and that we try our best, but only God is able to really wash us clean and be able to blot out our iniquities, coming from verse 9, or blot out our sins, be able to pull that out so that we are able to enjoy the salvation of what God has done. The other Old Testament text this week is from Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 to 4 and 9 through 15. This is another one of these texts where the Israelites are out in the wilderness and are complaining and stating that, okay, when we were in Egypt, there were pots of meat to eat, we had our fill of bread, and now God has brought us out into the wilderness to die. And they're complaining to Moses and Aaron about this. And so Moses then comes up in front of the congregation and to Aaron as well, and stating that, no, the Lord has not done this to kill them, and then lays out the recommendations on how we are going to be doing manna from heaven and have quail. So this idea of how there will be at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you'll have your fill of bread. Quails will fall overnight, and then there'll be a thin dew layer that covers the ground with a fine flaky substance, and that is manna. This what is it bread that people are asking about. I do say I think it is a little unfortunate that it stops there. I wish they included a little bit more of the gathering restrictions, and I'll explain a little bit more of that later. But remember, they're only supposed to be gathering enough for 1 day's fill outside of on Saturday, collecting 2 days worth for the Sabbath, or on Friday, however their Sabbath lining up, but the day before their Sabbath, so that they have 2 days worth of food, otherwise it spoils. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 78, verses 23 to 29. This is tying into that manna again, coming down from heaven, and it's how it's being provided, giving a taste of the abundance of God and recognizing the power that God has to be able to provide this and bring food to the camp of wherever the Israelites are. This recognition on the control and power that God does really have within creation. The New Testament text this week, or epistle text this week, is from Ephesians chapter 4, the first 16 verses of it. This is a text where we have to recognize that the patience that it takes with God, that we are in this one body, this one spirit, this one baptism that God has given to us, and the gift of life that it is. But that also means that we run a little bit more on what God's time is. And recognizing in that, as we are uncovering what our gift is that God has given us. And so the time that it takes for us to discover what our gift is, that in doing that, then recognizing that each of us will be given different gifts, and that we are trying to then understand these gifts and be able to use them in the way that God has intended for us to be able to use them, to be able to do it for the ministry in the way that God has intended. And in being able to do that so that love is being spoken out, so that all of us may grow and become a more united body, being able to work together from all these different gifts that each of us have. The gospel text this week is out of John chapter 6, verses 24 to 35. We are still in this bread of life discourse, and as this continues, I think it's an interesting conversation that we're having, but I really do enjoy this drop in here. The crowd notices that Jesus isn't around. They go looking for him. They find him, and they're asking, when did you get to this part of the sea, as they find that he's in a different place. Jesus responds with, from verse 26, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because of the signs, but because you ate your fill of loaves." Remember, they just did the feeding of the 5,000. "Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set his seal." And they're then asking, what must we do to perform these works, coming from verse 28. And this is then recognizing that Jesus has been sent to proclaim and do different work, but along with the aspect that they are called to do these different things. And this is where we get the tie-in from the Exodus text, coming from verse 31. "Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." And this recognition on how God has continued to provide, but they're not understanding that they're called into so much more than just eating bread. And Jesus encouraging them to be able to get beyond this bread that perishes away, this thing of just temporary satisfaction, something that is going to be much more long-lasting in order for us to sustain. So, before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plug for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between the Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, different thought processes. It's an amazing place and resource over there between their commentaries and podcasts and discussions. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, even though it's changed a little bit, and there's certain things that I wish they'd change back different ways, but I digress. But I also really do enjoy how they have the art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, even a daily devotion. There's a lot of great resources over there. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend it. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection going through the lectionary text week to week, just like this podcast, that covers ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies to be able to bring into your weekly preaching. If you enjoy listening to this podcast week after week, I'd highly recommend checking that out. But I also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Rising publication, which is a monthly newsletter talking about some different events and different things going on in the upper Midwest of the United States, but along with a lot of other great resources and ideas and things that other people are doing to help with the environment. If you are listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I'd highly recommend checking that stuff out. The links to that will be down in the show notes, the first link in the show notes. Not gonna lie, I'm a little excited about talking about this week's subject because it is such breaking, cutting-edge news, which I don't typically go this fresh, but I feel like it fits really well with what we're talking about this week. And I think it's worth then making known, so it's something that we can continue to track as a community thinking about this, but I think it's also worth us thinking about what this means physically now, here and now, but I think also what is Jesus getting at with these texts as we are getting into this. So let's talk about it. And you maybe heard about it a little bit this week if you follow any scientific news, but it is talking about dark oxygen. So dark oxygen is kind of a very interesting subject, but in order for us to get there, we have to understand how we understand oxygen previously until this recent paper that is still causing a lot of ripple effects, and there's a lot of controversy still with it. The way we've understood oxygen being able to be developed and processed here for us to be able to breathe is through photosynthesis, which is something you probably learned about in grade school. It's splitting water and carbon dioxide, which produces sugar and oxygen as byproducts, and thus allowing us to be able to breathe out carbon dioxide and water vapor, thus being able to start that process back and forth. And it's that process that's beautiful, be able to have sustained life here on the planet. Andrew Sweetman of the Scottish Association for Marine Science in 2013 went to a region between Hawaii and Mexico called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is a large seabed which is about the size of India. And as part of what they were doing was trying to figure out the level of oxygen dissolving as they went further down in the ocean. So they were collecting samples down at the seabed and expecting to look at how is oxygen reduced over time and looking at the microorganisms and how fast are they consuming it, thus being able to kind of predict how many microorganisms were there. In 2013, when he did this, he got some surprising results in that the oxygen levels were as high, if not higher, than the surface level where oxygen was on the ocean, and blamed it on bad sensors and marked it up as just a weird outlier of data and bad data. In 2021, he returned with a different system, different measurements, and got similar results. They were at 4,000 to 5,000 meters down, which is 2.5 to 3 miles down, and was getting oxygen levels that were as high, if not higher, than the surface. Now, typically how this works is that as oxygen kind of dissolves or is kind of absorbed in water, it makes it so it's denser, and thus as it's colder, it's easier for that denser oxygen to be absorbed into water. So thus it sinks, and it allows for it to go into the thermohaline circulation, otherwise known as like the ocean currents. And we've talked about that before. And these currents are big and long, 100-year to 1,000-year long currents based off of this oxygen going in and the more oxygen rich going to the bottom of the ocean to be able to circulate around and providing life. But now having the possibility of going back in 2021, using a different method, finding yet again that there is oxygen coming in this new way is causing huge ripple effects to recognize that maybe there is more going on with oxygen than we initially thought within our oceans. What they have discovered is polymetallic modules, which are rock-like structures that are precipitating the metal out of the water and being able to nucleate it around some form. So it could be a rock, a shell, a bone, but essentially the deposits of the water being able to kind of build like a rock-like structure around this particulate matter. Kind of similar to kind of like what we've talked about in the past, how pearls are made for oysters, but now this just being out in the open. With this happening, there seems to be, because of the different metal deposits and having different metal ions, that there is electrical current that is within these nodules or rock-like structures, which is allowing for the hypothesis of electrolysis, which is splitting the water into hydrogen and oxygen atoms, and thus being more of like a natural battery. And we have seen in sections and pockets of the ocean before where stuff like this has happened. Salt water in the presence of rusted metal can produce small amounts of this electrical currents, thus being able to do some of this electrolysis. But this is at higher levels. And so the test that they were doing was taking like these small jars, sterilizing them, bringing them down, going down to the surface, sealing them off, making sure that there wasn't any type of oxygen contamination, and thus being able to bring them to the surface and see what happens. And over a period of time, couple days, the oxygen levels increase and getting to a plateaued level. And so thus they gathered some of these rocks, sent them to another scientist to be able to study them in their lab on Northwestern's campus, and found that it was pulling about 0.95 volts of power on these rock-like structures nodules. So there is some type of electrical current, and that's where they're hypothesizing that there is some type of metal ion switch is how this is all going about. This is where I think it gets a little sticky, is because we have to understand the reason that Andrew Sweetman and his crew was out there is based off of deep sea mining companies paying for the studying of these deposits to be looked at and see what's going on. And like we stated, this is metal deposits that are being precipitated out of the water, which is allowing for things like cobalt, manganese, nickel being deposited on these rocks. Thus, if you are part of our modern society, you recognize how important these are to many of our electronics and just day-to-day life in the continued electrification and computerization, and now even getting into the processing for AI. These metals are extremely valuable to be able to do that. One of the issues from a study in 2016, 2017, looking at an area that was deep sea mined in the 1980s, returning back 35 years later, and it is completely uninhabited even by bacteria, versus areas that were not deep sea mined, that is, there is abundant life there. What are we all then dealing with here? We are recognizing that typical oxygen, we can notice it and see down a couple hundred meters to 1,000 meters. To get to the point where we're having this oxygen increasing in these levels that are at 4,000 or 5,000 meters down is absolutely phenomenal, and it is a huge thing now to be looking at and researching, and potentially causes changes in our understanding of potentially how life formed here on Earth. and is making for a lot of additional questions, and especially that this data has been really only shared for about a week, has made for a lot more questions than answers at this point. But it also has risen another problem. How a lot of modern science is run, and we have talked about this in the podcast before as well, is that it is very difficult to fund science, so thus you get somewhat biased science in certain forms and fashions at times because we have companies with biased perspectives or wanting certain results doing a lot of the research. Now, granted, there's typically some types of checks and balances, but research like this is coming from deep sea mining companies. And thus they already are looking to put out a report here within the next week or so as their rebuttal and stating that there is problems and flaws with how they did things. And we also then realize that part of that is because they are economically invested into this. This is a huge discovery, and it also shows the potential on how our deep sea currents are not purely dependent on photosynthesis and microorganisms and bacteria being able to produce all this photosynthesis to make the ocean currents run, but that the oceans also have some of their own metrics. And thus, we have to be extremely careful on how we are then potentially looking at and if we are going to mine some of these deep sea deposits. I think it really gets back to a lot of what some of these different texts are that we've had here this week. If you think about here the David text, for instance, this is the continuation on, I have a problem and I can fix it better than my asking God about it. I can figure this out, to the point where then David realizes how much David has screwed up. We know then the Exodus story with the manna coming from heaven, and this is why I wish that they had included the additional verses talking about the restrictions on how much they could gather and eat. Because is there a way that we can potentially still do some deep sea mining? Sure, but I think we have to be very strategic and might even need to evaluate our processing on how we're doing this if we're going back to sites that were mined 35 years ago and realizing that the biodiversity that was there is completely gone and has not recovered at all. I think it means and allows for us to be thinking about our processes and thinking about what is the best way of doing this stuff, and does it mean that we need to keep consuming more, or maybe we need to think about less? How do we recycle and use the resources that we already have better? And I think that's where the Ephesians text comes in really well as well. Thinking about how God is this provider and God is giving these gifts, but we have to think strategically as a body, and how do we develop these gifts and think critically and do things to the best of our ability that are going to be good for everyone in the long run. That's the hard part. That's beyond just my lifetime. That's beyond my future kids' lifetime. That's thinking beyond to centuries in the future, making sure that it's still a livable place to be. That's hard. But that's also kind of what Jesus is talking about here. The easy things, the fruit that seems to be just low-hanging fruit, and you're just coming because I fed you. And let's be honest, there's plenty of times that we use this same tactic within youth ministry and all these different things, but we're also trying to make sure that we are giving more than just food, that we are giving something of depth and substance that is going to long outlive the food that's in their stomach. I think when we're looking at and thinking about deep sea mining, when we're thinking about how ecosystems are running and what does this mean for the long term, we have to think beyond the current economic moment, which is hard. And especially when it seems like this would be so easy to do. We have the technology to be able to do this, but we have to think critically and make sure, is this the best way of doing this? Does this make sense? That's where these questions get really hard and difficult for us to be able to answer. We have to be able to think critically. We have to be able to look at resources and weigh the pros and cons. We're seeing huge biological diversity around these nodules, and it's providing a resource to these marine life in a place that they wouldn't expect. And the thing that we don't know is, if we take that away, how does that affect everything around it? We don't understand that. Welcome to ecology and trying to figure out how all these different relationships work. And that can take a tremendous amount of time. But we're also seeing these as extremely valuable resources that could be extremely helpful economically as we are trying to potentially greenify our world and for other purposes. And otherwise it drives up costs. But I think that it gets us to this point of, when is enough enough? How much consumption do we really need to do? These are hard questions. These are not easy questions. These are questions that I feel like we are teetering on and we've been thinking about and contemplating, but I think we are confronting more and more. Jesus is kind of calling out this consumption behavior. Jesus is calling and asking for you to be thinking more critically and trying to figure out things that are more diverse, with more depth, that's more sustaining. The bread that will be with you always. Is that not curiosity? Is that not understanding? Is that not trying to understand and see how these pieces come together? Yes, we could harvest this huge deposit that's the size of India. And let's be honest, we could probably do it within a decade. But once we do that, it's gone. We don't understand anymore the depth and the understanding of what does that do for our marine ecosystems. And how little we have actually discovered of marine ecosystems is a whole nother podcast. But it's very small. We've really only explored like maybe 5% of the oceans. So do we want to take that away so quickly? Or do we want to make the difficult choice of understanding what we have before it's gone? So the question I have for you this week is, when have you had to make the difficult decision to wait on something that seemed like I could just do it now? When did you have to make the difficult decision to wait on something that you easily could do just right now for the betterment of something? I know it's difficult. I know it's hard. And heck, there's things even within this own podcast that I have purposely held myself back on because I needed to work on processes. I needed to work on things to make it better, more efficient, more sustainable, instead of just immediately jumping and then getting over my head. I needed to understand what was the reach and what was going on and how was I doing this and different factors within my life changing and how does that affect things before I just start jumping in with 2 feet. I really, in my personal opinion, I really hope that we really study this dark oxygen a lot more. We understand what is it providing to the marine ecosystem and what's the effects. And even if that means that there is less electronics for me to be able to consume, maybe it forces me to really look at and think and evaluate what I'm purchasing. Maybe it forces me to think about making sure that the resources and the things that I am consuming, I'm trying to get back so that they are able to be recycled and reused to the best of their ability. I don't think this stuff is crazy. I think as a world, we can take economic downturns slightly for the betterment of long-term sustainability. And I think we should. And I know that's a hard pill to swallow, and it's something that seems weird that, well, why would you slow something for long-term? But I'd rather have something that is able to last for centuries on end, that my great-grandkids are still able to do, because we did it in a sustainable way instead of just, well, we did it quick, we did it hard, and now it's gone. And it's no longer able to be there. And I think we have plenty of examples where we've seen that and the long-term ramifications where we wish, I wish we hadn't done that. I think there's a value into that patience. I think there is a value of questioning. I think there is a value of having curiosity and going back and exploring and spending that time. I implore you, I'll put the scientific paper down below. I implore you to read through it, think about it, contemplate it. Because I think that's where we should be in our world. We should be at a spot where we take the time to think and consider. Because if we aren't, what are we actually doing? And how can we develop our gifts if we don't ever sit and think and contemplate and consider? Because in doing that, it will allow us to be able to start seeing what some of our different gifts are. We'll be able to help point out gifts in others. It will allow us to become the people who God has created us to be. Living lives within restrictions is a healthy thing. Making sure that we're not just coveting other things. Take David. Take the spoiling of manna and quail. God has told us to be managers, but that also means we need to manage ourselves. Making sure that we're looking for things that are actually sustainable for us long term than just for a short period of time. Long-term sustainability is an important thing, and I think in a world in which we're at, that is going to become more and more a topic of conversation. And especially if we keep going for efficiency, then we also need to make sure that sustainability is in that conversation as well, for you and for me. And maybe in doing all this, we'll figure out more and more what does it actually mean to be like what Jesus is stating and have something that is driving us and sustaining us so much more than just the low-hanging, easy fruit within our faith life, within our life, and within our calling, and what we will do next. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.